Yes, welcome again officially to this EUROSTUDENT Talks webinar starting the 2025 series. I'm glad you joined us and hope you all had a good start into 2025. We have, let's say, policy-oriented version today and are very glad to welcome our guests Ninoslav Shukanek-Schmidt and Horia Onita to learn about the framework for the social dimension in the European higher education area. Most of you will probably have heard something about it, but you will get a very thorough overview today, which I'm very much looking forward to. And we also have the chance to discuss at the end. So if any questions come up, don't hesitate to note them and pose them later. We have real experts here. I think the best people we could have to tell us about this, because they have been involved in the topic actively for a very long time. Ninoslav is the founder and director of the Institute for the Development of Education in Croatia and has been involved in the topic of the social dimension within the European higher education area for a long time. He co-chaired the Bologna follow-up group's working group on the social dimension in the previous round, so from 2021 to 2024, and has thus supported the adoption of the EHEA Framework for the social dimension by the ministers in Tirana, which we will learn about today. This has been preceded also by active involvement in all the processes leading to it, which we will hear about. And besides this, he is also engaged with the Council of Europe as a higher education policy expert in the Steering Committee for Education of the Working Group on the Democratic Mission of Higher Education. Horia Onita has changed sides. He has been involved in the promotion of the social dimension in European higher education also for 8 years, previously as president of the European Students' Union, co-chairing together with Nino the working group on the social dimension, as well as the drafting committee of the Tirana communique, and has also represented students in other relevant bodies. Now he is the head of the European Higher Education Area Secretariat, so continues to be strongly involved in the development and promotion of the social dimension. And he is located in at the Secretariat, co-hosted by Romania and the Republic of Moldova. And he's also pursuing a PhD at the University of Bucharest. So Ninos will give us the big overview with Horia looking into the future, and both will be available for the discussion later. So very excited to hear the presentation and would hand over to Ninoslav so you can start sharing and talking.
Thank you very much, Christina. I would just like you to confirm that you can hear me and that you can see the full screen of my presentation.
All good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So as Christina introduced my presentation, I will be speaking about the new European higher education area framework for the social dimension, and we'll try to explain today what does it tell us and where are we heading. Maybe at the beginning, it would be useful just to present very briefly, once again, my home institution, Institute for the Development of Education in Croatia, which is a European think tank committed to advancing policies in higher education in 3 key areas: equity and inclusion, community engagement in higher education, where we are establishing the European platform for community engagement, and quality assurance, where we link quality with inclusion and engagement with society. And our institute provides consultancy services in all these 3 key areas to public authorities and higher education institutions in Europe. As Christina already introduced my work, I'm Nino Schmidt. I'm the founder and the executive director of the Institute for the Development of Education. And for this presentation, it is important that I co-chaired together with EUROSTUDENT the Bologna follow-up working group on social dimension, and I did it in 2 mandates since 2018 till 2020, and then in the second mandate after 2020 until last year. It is important because these working groups successfully created the first EHEA framework for the social dimension that we will explain today, that helps or will help 47 EHEA countries improve social dimension policies in higher education. Back also in Croatia, it is important to mention that in the period 2015 to 2021, I was a member of the Croatian National Committee for enhancing the social dimension of higher education. So I have both European and the national perspective when we talk about equity, inclusion, and social dimension in higher education. Maybe just at the beginning, very briefly to mention the Bologna process for all those who are not familiar, because this is the main voluntary intergovernmental cooperation at European level in the field of higher education, nowadays implemented in 47 states, which define the European higher education area. Bologna process since 1999 guides the collective effort of public authorities and the European Commission on how to build more inclusive, innovative, and interconnected EHEA. Bologna has a quite large organizational structure, and the Bologna Follow-up Group, or BFUG, is the executive structure supporting the Bologna process in between the ministerial conferences. But the BFUG, as you can see on the screen, has a quite large number of working bodies. And for today's presentation, it is important working group on social dimension, because both Korea and we were co-chairing this working group, and this working group has produced this EHEA framework for the social dimension. Also, before I will present the framework, I think it is important to clarify some key concepts related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you might know, diversity is a fact, because in our higher education systems, we do have learners who have different characteristics, backgrounds, and needs. Equity is a principle because all learners are considered as equally important and have equal opportunities. And inclusion is a process because it is supposed to remove barriers to achieve equity in education. Diversity is a fact, but it can be also a goal, because in different higher education systems, some groups of learners are underrepresented. So the goal could be to increase the number of these underrepresented groups. But when we speak about equality and equity, it's not the same. Equality of treatment is not the same as equity. While equality implies uniformity, equity focuses on creating fair opportunities tailored to individual needs. So we might have equal higher education systems, but as you can see from the picture, the learners might not reach the objectives related to equity and inclusion, but the equity would basically secure that they reach their objectives, because equitable higher education systems will create fair opportunities that are tailored to individual needs of all learners. Now, social dimension is a term that is very much related to the European higher education area, is basically the combination of all these 4 terms that are, as we've learned now, distinct but still interconnected. So social dimension within the Bologna process includes the concept of diversity, equality of opportunities, equity, and inclusion. But I will speak about the definition more in detail on social dimension in the Bologna process later. Also, there are three dimensions of equity, inclusion, and the social dimension. First dimension relates to access that ensures that the conditions it removes barriers for individuals to access higher educational institutions or programs that match their needs or educational objectives. Second dimension is well-being. It is important to ensure an optimal experience for all learners in the educational system, leading to a comprehensive and balanced development of each individual's potential. And the third dimension relates to achievement. It is important to reduce differences in educational achievements among different groups of learners, preventing dropout and stimulating further education. So now when we have learned the key concepts and what they mean, now we can present the overview of policy development related to equity, inclusion, and social dimension within the Bologna process. The notion of the social dimension has been embedded into the policy objectives of the Bologna process for a very long time, since 2001. But in that period between 2001 and 2000, I would say, or 2020, the definition of the social dimension was not quite clear, and it has changed very often its meaning. And the notion of the social dimension has been introduced by student representatives into the Bologna process, and it has not, as a term, derived from the research that informed the policy objectives of the social dimension. So I would say, from my perspective, that the period of between 2001 and 2020 was very much characterized by the definitional anarchy related to the social dimension within the Bologna process. However, with the 2020 Rome communique, we got the first official definition of the social dimension, and the BFUG has formulated an important document, Principles and Guidelines, to strengthen the social dimension within the Rome communique. And this document, Principles and Guidelines, was really a game changer for the further development of social dimension in the EHEA. And this development continued in last year at the Tirana conference, the ministers adopted also indicators and descriptors for the principles of the social dimension, and that marked basically the end of the creation of the EHEA framework for the social dimension, because now the picture and the architecture for the social dimension is complete. So the EHEA policy framework for the social dimension in higher education, which was created and adopted through the documents of the Tirana communique last year, consists of the following elements. So the framework consists of 10 principles for the social dimension and its guidelines. Each principle has its indicators and descriptors, and indicators enable the creation of a system of monitoring, and we have been capable to create a European system of monitoring for the implementation of principles for social dimension, and it will enable the creation also of a national system of monitoring for the implementation of principles and guidelines. So this this is the structure of the new EHEA policy framework for the social dimension. The new definition of the social dimension, it is adopted in 2020 within the Rome communique, and it's now really complete. Earlier, I mentioned the key elements of the social, of the definition of the social dimension, but the definition from the communique is that the social dimension in higher education is a process aimed at creating an inclusive environment in higher education in which the composition of the student body entering, participating in, and completing higher education at all levels corresponds to the heterogeneous social profile of society at large in the EHEA countries. This definition of the social dimension encompasses the desired inclusive environment in higher education that fosters equity, diversity, and is responsive to the needs of local communities. So this is now the definition that is a part and that it is included in the EHEA framework for the social dimension. And it is important that now the Bologna process has the definition of the social dimension. The document that I mentioned, Principles and Guidelines, that has been developed by the BFUG Working Group on Social Dimension and adopted within the Rome Communique in 2020, contains 10 principles for the social dimension, and the principles should be understood as high-level statements that serve as political commitments and as a basis for the conceptualization of different policies for social dimension enhancement. Each principle has its guidelines, and guidelines are recommendations intended to advise policymakers on how the principles should be implemented in practice. As you can see on the screen, these principles cover, I would say, 10 key areas or 10 key policy areas in higher education, and they encompass strategic approach to the social dimension in higher education. They highlight the importance of flexibility of higher education systems, inclusiveness of the entire education system, so to connect higher education with other levels of education. They stress the importance of monitoring, data collection, counseling, funding, inclusive institutional culture at higher education institutions, inclusive international mobility. They also stress the importance of community engagement for social dimension. And finally, they stress the importance of policy dialogue between all the stakeholders within higher education on how these principles should be implemented in practice at national and also at the European level. Indicators are, as I mentioned earlier, adopted and endorsed by ministers at the Tirana Ministerial Conference last year. And indicators are tools for measuring progress in implementing the principles of the social dimension. Each indicator has its descriptor, which outlines characteristics of the indicators in more detail, providing a better understanding of the indicators and how they can be implemented. These document indicators and descriptors adopted last year is not prescriptive and it enables each EHEA country to implement the indicators in a way that suits their national higher education systems. The BFEG working groups that Jorge and I were co-chairing had a very good cooperation with the European Commission EURIDICE, and we are very glad that we succeeded with the help of the European Commission and the EURIDICE to create a European level system of monitoring the progress of the implementation of the principles. And as I said, we hope that these indicators and descriptors will enable also the creation of national systems of monitoring. The first report that EURIDICE has created in 2022, so they collected data from EURIDICE countries on the implementation of all 10 principles for social dimension. The results indicate that EHEA systems have put in place policies for nearly 42% of the interventions required to meet the commitments from principles and guidelines. So this first result of European monitoring shows that definitely there is a space for improvement in the implementation of principles and guidelines by many countries in the European higher education area. We were also very lucky that the EURIDICE within the European Commission was capable also to create the second round of monitoring the implementation of the principles and guidelines. And the results are published within the European higher education area in 2024 report, the report that was published for the Tirana Ministerial Conference. And here I can show some results related to the implementation of some principles for the social dimension. So here you can see the results for the first principle that says that the social dimension should be central to higher education strategies at system and higher education institutions level, as well as at the EHEA level. And the result here shows that the majority of education systems with available data have strategies or action plans currently in place on the social dimension of higher education. And 2/3 of these strategies target both students and academic staff, while 1/3 of them address the situation of students only. And specific strategies or policy plans on the social dimension of higher education have been adopted in Austria, Croatia, Finland, Ireland, Lithuania, Netherlands, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Another result for the principle 7 on inclusive institutional culture that says that public authorities should help higher education institutions to strengthen their capacity in responding to the needs of a more diverse student and staff body. It encompasses basically the support of public authorities for training, initial and continuing professional training for both academic and administrative staff. And in the result, you can see that the countries, for instance, like Austria, Czechia, and Malta are the only countries that fulfill really all of the criteria related to this principle. But at the other extreme, there are 11 systems in red that currently fulfill none of the criteria related to the implementation of this principle. And maybe looking into more detail on the results for this for the implementation of this principle, here you can see that the majority of systems, 28 of them, have no requirements or recommendations and offer no specific financial support to higher education institutions to undertake staff training on equity, inclusion, and diversity. Therefore, I would say there is a significant scope for future action, and the minority of systems that already take action can offer examples of practice to build upon. Like, for instance, Ireland has the 4th generation of National Access Plan, and it is visible in that plan that the public authorities provide targeted funding opportunities for higher education institutions that promote teaching and learning enhancements, especially in universal design. In Flemish community in Belgium, the government provides financial support to a public body funded by the state, which is called EHEA, to develop and organize, for instance, training on student mental health issues. And the last example related to monitoring, related to the implementation of an important principle on policy dialogue that says that public authorities should engage in a policy dialogue with higher education institutions and other relevant stakeholders about how the above principles and guidelines can be translated and implemented both at national system and institutional level. Here, you can clearly see that around Europe, there has been some response to the adoption of these principles. However, on the screen, you can see that more than half of the EHEA countries have not yet established a national policy dialogue focusing on the implementation of the principles and guidelines. And there are 19 systems in red, indicating that no policy dialogue has yet begun with regard to the implementation of the principles and guidelines. However, always the red colors means that the systems have not started certain actions, and green colors shows that they are doing rather well in implementing the principles. Here you can see that 7 systems are very advanced in the implementation of this principle. And we see that some countries like Austria, for instance, organizes for instance, annual network conferences that bring together a wide array of stakeholders from the higher education sector. And these conferences are an important forum for discussing interim evaluations of the implementation of national Austrian strategy on the social dimension. And this is the place where the stakeholder could provide structured feedback, and then it can serve to public authorities to improve policies related to social dimension. So here we can see that the monitoring on the European level shows that many countries have started to implement some principles or some elements of the new EHEA framework for the social dimension, but we see that also there is a huge space for progress in the upcoming years. And an important also information that along with the Rome communique and the document principles and guidelines, and then the document on indicators and descriptors you can find on the website of the EHEA.info. But here you can also find one more document, which is a report on peer learning activities for the social dimension. And this report has been produced within one project that has supported the work of the BFEG Working Group on Social Dimension, that has organized peer learning activities, and also one project, Erasmus project, that has organized peer learning activities for social dimension. And this report synthesizes findings and best practices from the 4 peer learning activities organized around Europe. So the objective was to enhance the exchange of best practices among EHEA countries at varying levels of implementing the principles of the social dimension. And the report provides also the overview of different practices in Europe, but then also conclusions and recommendations on how national authorities, higher education institutions, and other stakeholders can collaborate more effectively to implement the principles of the social dimension. So I'll finish my presentation by saying that significant development has happened in the period between 2020 and 2024 for the social dimension within the Bologna process. Now the Bologna process at the European higher education area have the new EHEA Framework for the social dimension, which presents the new policy architecture for this for social dimension and equity and inclusion. However, long-term policy landscape for the implementation of the framework is yet to be developed. So my colleague Horia will now explain more in detail how the Bologna process has envisaged the work on social dimension from now until 2027. Horia?
Yes, thank you very much, Nino, and of course, thank you to the EUROSTUDENT colleagues for the invitation and all those attending. I would just start by pointing out that in 2018, I believe it was the Bologna process implementation report that was referring to this vicious cycle where we have several ministerial communiques within the Bologna process looking at various commitments and calling for supporting the social dimension of higher education with not pretty much follow-up or developments from cycle to cycle. This time in 2024, when we had the Tirana ministerial conference in May, the situation was very different. So we had two cycles in which the working groups on social dimension developed firstly the principles and guidelines, the broad policy framework, and then indicators and descriptors to support the implementation. And EUROSTUDENT contributed to the working groups a lot, both with the data, but also with the conceptual frameworks. And I'm happy to see that many of the or some of the participants today are also those who attended the working groups, contributed, even co-chaired the working group on social dimension. So thank you for that. The ministers in 2024 endorsed the indicators and the descriptors, but also talked about some other elements in the Tirana communique. They referred to the socio-economic challenges of students. They called for tackling or committing to tackle these challenges to ensure accessible student support services, inclusive learning environments, gender equality, and supporting students to cover the indirect costs of study. They also called for supporting data collection and expressly mentioned the EUROSTUDENT initiative as one example. So what now? Is the question. We have the policy framework, and of course, the natural next step is to look into the implementation. That's why in the BFUG meeting in Budapest in September 2024, when the BFUG discussed the work program for 2024 to 2027, when the next ministerial conference will take place in May in Romania and Moldova, in Iași and Chișinău, the focus shifted to implementation. And that's why for the social dimension of higher education, the BFUG decided to establish a thematic peer group on social dimension, a new TPGD, co-chaired by ESU, by the European Students' Union, by Malta, and by Latvia. This TPGD went under the umbrella of the BICG, which is the Bologna Implementation Coordination Group. A group is established in 2018 as a follow-up of the Paris Ministerial Conference to support a very specific mechanism to implement Bologna policy commitments. Of course, the BICG focused from 2018 up until now on the key commitments, those that the ministers deemed essential as building blocks for the whole acquis, if we can call it like this, of the Bologna. So looking at 3-degree structure, recognition, and quality assurance. And now we have a fourth TPG, the TPGD on social dimension, focusing on peer learning, on supporting the implementation of the principles and guidelines. Of course, there is a conceptual differently approach because the key commitments are technical elements. Social dimension is what we may call in the public policy landscape a wicked problem. It doesn't call for a straightforward solution. It's not a yes or no question. You have to look at various variables, and you have to look at outcomes to see exactly what works and what doesn't work. So in the 2024-2027 Bologna policy framework, DPGD, this thematic peer group, will be the one that will tackle the work of the Bologna and the developments in social dimension. Of course, it's not the only working structure that tangentially, at least, looks at social dimension. We have the working group on fundamental values, and some aspects related to social dimension are inherently linked to student participation, to public responsibility for higher education. We have a continuation of the coordination group on global policy dialogue, which also looks at cooperation with other macro regions, also in relation to the right to inclusive higher education. And there is a working group on internationalization and mobility that will deliver an action plan to support mobility in EHEA. And among the aspects that the working group will look into according to their terms of reference is also the aspect of inclusive mobility, which is a principle in the principles and guidelines for social dimension as well. So right now, the TPGs have been established, so the TPGD on social dimension as well. And the ministerial communique, the Tirana communique, calls for the creation of national action plans. So the member states, the BFUG countries, will deliver these national action plans to exactly show how they aim to fulfill the commitments that the ministers took in the Tirana communique. As part of these national action plans, we should expect also actions on social dimension that implement the principles and guidelines. The part on social dimension will contribute to what the thematic peer group on social dimension will do, being a space for stakeholders, for student representatives, for higher education institutions, all of them part of the BFUG, of the EHEA framework as consultative members, and of course for BFUG representatives, national authorities, to discuss and to support each other in implementing these activities that, as I mentioned, will be fed into from the national action plan. So it's a pretty exciting period. There was a very thorough work on conceptualizing, on looking at various sources to create this broad policy framework, the EHEA policy framework on social dimension. And now the next step is, of course, to see how this can be implemented, what works, what doesn't work, and of course to look at priorities, because the ministers committed to create an inclusive, innovative, and interconnected EHEA by 2030. So we are a bit in the middle, considering that the commitment was taken in the Rome ministerial communique in 2020. So the next years focus on implementation. There is also a project application that was announced by the co-chairs of the TPG, also to support the work of the working structure. So that's where we are now. The social dimension is now positioned as a central pillar within the EHEA, is one of the three overarching political priorities, if we can call them like that. And also looking backwards at my experience as a co-chair of the working structure, I also believe it epitomized a very specific collaborative approach. There were almost 20 iterations of the document with myself and Nino liaising not only, or working not only with the members of the working group, but also with the European Commission, with the BFUG, with external stakeholders, with the project Plarupax that supported the working group on social dimension, in order to, in a way, catalyze those indicators, to catalyze those policy knowledge outcomes that actually would make sense, to say so, to be part of the broad commitment in the principles and guidelines. Also being aware of a very specific element. The principles and guidelines and the indicators need to be in a way, the common denominator. And we all know that there is a risk that when you try to find the lowest common denominator, you go into very broad or general commitments. So I believe it actually a success that we managed to go beyond these very broad commitments and actually commit to some certain or specific elements related to social dimension, of course guided by the fundamental values and the principles that go behind the Bologna process. I would not want to go more into presenting this, because I really hope that we will able to go into let's say so future elements when we also discuss questions and we hear your contributions as the audience for the webinar. So that's why I'm going to finish here, and just hope that we can continue this in the Q&A section. And I think I'm going back to Nino.
Thank you very much, Horia. Thank you to all of you for listening our presentation of the EHEA Framework for the Social Dimension. And now, Christina, we go back to you.
Yes, thank you to you, Nino and Horia, for this look back and into the future and a comprehensive overview of what has been happening. And I think it's a very encouraging sign what Horia last said, that indeed the social dimension is now a central pillar of the European higher education area. I would first like, well, so thank you, and I'm going to click the applause button for you so be sure you get it. Before I have some questions for you, but before that, I would indeed like to open the floor to the audience to see if we have any questions. You are welcome to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Maybe while everyone collects their thoughts, you can reflect a bit back. And in some points of both of your contributions, you already touched upon some challenges. One that has been overcome to some extent, the definitional anarchy related to the social dimension, the complexity of the problem as such, that it doesn't really have a straightforward solution, and the danger of landing on the lowest common denominator when actually agreeing on these guidelines. Can you reflect a bit on what the main discussion points? I mean, there are 47 countries who have thoughts, who all come from different starting points. We also saw the current status in the maps you showed, Nino. So what were the main discussion points and challenges in developing the principles and guidelines and indicators over since Rome? Whoever both wants to, either of you. Nino, I think you already unmuted yourself, so please go ahead.
Yeah. So from my side, I can say that the first period between 18 and 2020, when we have created principles and guidelines, and these are really very broad concepts. It was, from my perspective, relatively easy, and most of the countries really agreed on these 10 areas for these key policy areas for social dimension. However, when we have approached in the second term the creation of indicators and descriptors, and these are really some down to the earth, I would say, concepts that needs to basically show what the countries are doing when they're implementing certain principles. Here, the situation became more complicated and sometimes difficult, because then we've seen how different are these 47 countries within a European higher education area. You have some countries that for them is quite common to have a targeted approach when we speak about social dimension, equity, and inclusion. So to create a strategic framework, to have objectives, measures, indicators. So for some countries, this is completely normal and the way how they create policies. However, for some countries have a more universal approach to equity inclusion, particularly in the northern part of Europe, and they have included equity inclusion like into all elements of financing of higher education and the different structures and organizations of higher education systems. So for them is not so common then to create a particular targeted strategic measures. So it was quite challenging basically to find indicators that would satisfy all of the 47 countries, but we succeeded. And at the end, all of the countries agreed on all of the indicators that we have, that the ministers have endorsed at the Tirana Ministerial Conference. So I would consider it a success. It required a lot of consultations, but that's the strength of the Bologna process and the European higher education area, because you have many different countries, but they sit together, they work together, and they find a common solution. And I think that the solution that we found is a very good one. But maybe Horia would like to share his experience.
Thank you very much. I also recall we had, for example, discussion on counseling services. There were those who were arguing that in the indicators we should state that higher education institutions should provide services for psychological counseling, for vocational counseling, and there were others who were saying that in their own national environment, while they do agree that students should receive those services, it's not for the higher education institutions to provide them. The same discussion emerged, for example, in relation to accommodation services. And I think also here there are various interesting pieces of information from EUROSTUDENT publications. So there are different models and institutions, because in comparison with other policy areas in higher education, social dimension developed in a very strong socio-cultural context. And there are some sticky institutions in this regard. Also, in comparison with, for example, quality assurance, there is a lack of an overarching regulatory body like a QA agency that would create a virtuous policy implementation framework. And of course, we had to consider the implementation challenges. Also, looking at designing indicators, there were the data collection issues. For example, in some countries, you cannot collect data on specific categories of students. Nino also mentioned the different, let's say so, views on the concepts of equity and equality. And I would also say that there was a natural emphasis on forward mapping initiatives. We were not really backward mapping from the higher education institution level, because we already had very broad principles and guidelines that we had to operationalize. And finally, I would also say there was a bit of a challenge in a way going over old paradigms, because we see that the social profile or the socio-economical profile of students is changing. We have more mature learners, we have workers that are studying, not always students that are working. And we saw that there is a way of designing student support systems that advantages some students over others. So in a way, trying to approach the indicators based on this new evolving pattern of higher education, which changes also what social dimension should look into, was a bit of a both challenge, but also, let's say so, crucial point for us to make sure that the principles are up to the dates that to the day that they need to be implemented.
Thank you for this insight into your work. We now have an audience question, which I would like to pass on. To what extent would you say that the needs and difficulties, for instance, health of LGBTQI+ student group is important in the social dimension principles and among the EHEA countries? Maybe this goes to what you were saying, Horia, about data and the feasibility of assessing it. So I would ask you first to say something about this.
Yes, I would suggest now, let's say so, referring to another publication, ESU in their own publication, the Bologna with Student Eyes, actually asked questions to the national unions of students on whether the LGBTQ+ groups are considered a disadvantaged group and whether data is collected in this regard. So I would rely to that publication. There are two certain elements. We have countries that have a very narrow approach, in the sense that they define some underrepresented groups and they have some actions for those groups without necessarily having an overarching design in mind or a unitary approach. They just have different pieces of legislation that may serve one purpose or the other. In these cases, looking at the data from the Bologna with Student Eyes, there are a few countries having a specific policy for LGBTQ+ students. There is the other approach for a more universal design, to say so, where you have policies, holistic measures at national level, and it really depends on the higher education institution on how they design specific policies. And in this case, we do not have the data, but we may expect that there can be a different reality on the ground. And the second point is the question talks about health. And in the sense of health, there are two elements. Firstly, to what extent there is a collaboration over the board with other services that provide support in the health dimension, and that is the cultural phenomenon of mental health. And here we see that especially Eastern countries still even now have a, let's say so, reticence of addressing mental health issues, or even recognizing it in the same vein as Western or Nordic European countries. And it may be a bit of a not showing the data in the pattern. So there is an issue, but because it is culturally not the raise awareness dimension is not that obvious, we do not see it in the data, even though it's there.
Thank you. Maybe if I can add what I think is also important in this regard, or maybe what the question is a bit aiming at. So the principles, guidelines, and indicators don't define the groups themselves, but it's up to every country to define which are the student groups in need of support and for monitoring. So that is what you were saying with the different cultures in the countries, that it's not that the EHEA says this student group is important in all countries. I mean, there are some and they are mentioned, but it's not prescriptive in that sense. But every country is up to define them. Yes, Nino, if you want to add
maybe
more?
just to add to what you mentioned, Christina, and maybe to share the experience from Croatia, because Croatia took this strategic approach and created a national strategy and national action plan for enhancing the social dimension. But the first step before creating the national plan was basically to define which groups are underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable. And in Croatian case, we used very much data collected through EUROSTUDENT surveys. So EUROSTUDENT in Croatia enabled us to define these groups, and among these groups, LGBTQ+ are also mentioned as one of the underrepresented and vulnerable group. And for this group has then a national plan created certain measures on how to improve their position within Croatian higher education system. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. I see a raised hand from Helga Posselt from the Austrian Ministry. Please go ahead, Helga.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I'm really glad we have so many Austrian listeners here today. I'd like to add to what you've presented. You presented your work as of 2018 mainly, but the Austrian history for, as you mentioned, we have a strategy. For our strategy goes actually back to 2015 to the Yerevan communique. And this is an example that things don't go well if you don't follow them up, because we had in the working group on social dimension derived the so-called social dimension strategy, and it was a paper that countries really committed to, and it says to make our higher education more socially inclusive by implementing the EHEA social dimension strategy. And from 2015 to 2018, we didn't have a working group on the social dimension. So this wasn't followed up. It was assumed that if we have a working group on the implementation of everything, that would be sufficient. This proved to be wrong, because countries worked on whatever commitments they found they would like to work on. Austria took up this commitment, and we developed a strategy very much depending on data we had from our student social survey, same data that goes into the EUROSTUDENT. Our strategy goes until 2025, and you already mentioned that we have these networking conferences, which I think make a lot of use. And we were also already thinking about the National Action Plan, and there we hope to hope to be able to relaunch our strategy, but we will, however, continue with our efforts on developing and setting more implementation steps towards the full implementation of the principles and guidelines. We've developed our strategy before the principles and guidelines were there, so we are now going to check does that still fit. Yeah, however, I think it's really, really important to have, if you commit to something, that you follow it up with either a working group or in this case with the thematic peer group on the social dimension. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Helga. Martina Damanin, please go ahead. You also have some experience with it.
Yes, hi everyone. It's good to see the faces of the social dimension again and to join the conversation after some time. So yes, I was ex-president of ESO and co-chaired the social dimension group in 2021 with Nino. I've been now a bit more focused at the institutional level, so I'm still working on inclusion with the Knowledge Innovation Center. And at the institution level, I must say that when you talk about the Bologna process, it feels a little bit abstract. It's not that people are not aware of it, they are, but how it can be impactful and effective at the institution level, of course, there's always the fact that the Bologna process is for public authorities to advance on policy making at that level. So definitely there's always that primary focus that should always remain for the Bologna process. And it's nice to see how we went from having EUROSTUDENT data to now having the EURODICE data on these principles and guidelines. My thinking now is, how do we move those maps to become more green from red? And is there room to formalize a little bit better the role of institutions and student unions to advance the progress on these principles and guidelines?
Thank you. Interesting question. Who would like to respond? Nino or Uriah?
I could start by briefly, in a way, what Helga and Martina mentioned are connected, because indeed the strategy on equity and growth that was adopted in 2015 was all but forgotten. Austria is an exception in the sense that it actually followed up with a document, and I believe right now we are not in the same context with the principles and guidelines, fortunately. Firstly, because there is much more political commitment or awareness, let's say so, and also the strategic framework is a bit more inducive to following up, and we also have a TPG. The issue, I would say, looks into the monitoring side, of course, at the Bologna process level, but it also looks at how stakeholders push for implementation at national level. So now I'm talking with a hat of a stakeholder, former stakeholder in that sense, as a student representative, where for us at national level, in that case, it was important that the Bologna adopt something, even though at that time we were not confident, let's say so, that it would be implemented at national level. But we were aware through ESU, and probably higher education institutions aware to their own representative body, and so on and so forth, of what happens in the Bologna process, and it offered us a further incentive to push for implementation at national level, and also to have a bit of a more coherent framework in mind, to have this holistic perspective. Because you have to have a strategy on social dimension, but what I believe is also extremely important is that the principles and guidelines has principles talking about the links with school level system, and that's very important, and in some cases you have different ministries, the links with other ministries, be them employment, finances, so you in a way are incentivized to create these more strategical approaches that then may lead to implementation. And you have principle 10 on stakeholder involvement, so you don't have only the content issues, but also the procedural issues around it. And in the end, indeed, from what Martina said, principles and guidelines are for national authorities. For higher education institutions, I believe they can be a good framework in mind, But the question is how the national authorities actually operationalize them. The Plarupax project and let's see the potential future project may help in this regard by actually looking at the ground evidence and also looking not only at monitoring, because monitoring is important, but also equally important is to assess the outcomes of implementation, because you may have implemented something perfectly as the principles and guidelines say, but due to your own national environment, it may either not be sufficient or not adequate. So it's a bit of an interesting, let's say so, combination right there.
Thank you. Nino, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, thank you, Martina. First of all, thank you for the question and good to see you again. It was a pleasure to work and to co-chair the working group together with Martina. But Martina is really right. I think it is important to, from the European level, I think that we can improve the implementation if we exchange in the future more good practices. And when I think it is important to establish more peer learning activities so that the countries and higher education institutions learn from each other. Also, I think that the future or the current TPGD on social dimension will probably create some tools that will help also higher education institutions to translate principles and guidelines into concrete higher education institutions plans and or action plans on how to further develop equity and inclusion. But from my perspective on the national level, in the future, it will be very important to establish the real and structured policy dialogue between different stakeholders, as Horia has mentioned, because we see that in majority of EHEA countries, this has not happened yet. So this policy dialogue is crucial because if public authorities responsible for higher education sit together with higher education institutions, student representatives, community representatives, and other stakeholders that have an interest or influence over higher education, and if they create a structured forum and create then a structured plan on how to improve equity and inclusion, then that will be very important for higher education institutions, because I think that the ultimate goal is that students and staff at higher education institutions has better environment when we speak about equity and inclusion. So this I see as a task for the upcoming period until 2030 on a national level.
Thank you. I think we will use these as famous last words and your call. To hope that indeed the next BFUG period will bring this. I think, and I'm very confident that the work will be able to continue on this great groundwork that has been laid with the principles, guidelines, and indicators. And the discussions are going on. From the participants, I've seen that we also have institutional participants as well as people from ministry. So hopefully this also contributes to the policy dialogue or lays a seed in that direction. I don't see any raised hands and chats, and we are at the end of our time slot. So I would just really like to thank you again for this informative presentation and your willingness to let us see a bit behind the scenes in and your additional responses. Thank you very much. Also, thank you for to the participants. I hope you were able to take something interesting. In our own interest, the next EUROSTUDENT Talks will take place on February 13th, and we will be hearing about a research project on student mobility, combining EUROSTUDENT data and data from the European Tertiary Education Register. So some institutional framing to the EUROSTUDENT mobility data. Thank you, and everyone have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.